Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus Today. Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the American dream. Now, you could say the Western dream because that American dream applied, I think, somewhat equally to places like Australia and New Zealand and Canada and so on. Now, was it a reality? Was it a dream? Was it a delusion? Did it ever exist at all? Was it pure fantasy? Was it a reality way back when, but is it no longer a reality? So let's have a look at that. There's quite a lot of people saying that the American dream never existed. It was all a bit of capitalist propaganda bullshit, and it never existed. And we're all being sucked into. Now, younger people particularly tend to have that view. And I saw a movie review recently. I think it might have been done today by a critical drinker, and he reviewed that early 1990s movie Falling Down that starred Michael Douglas, and I thought it was quite good, actually, that movie, particularly the part where he says, look at the adverts for the like the fast food burger place, look at the adverts on how good the burger looks, and then you look at the real thing. He said, look, it's nothing like this. The adverts are bullshit, and the whole thing's bullshit. But that's by the 90s things were changing, and whilst I don't agree fully with the sentiment of the movie, I think it was reasonably well done, particularly where things are heading. And Critical Drinker actually points this out, that it's as poignant, if not more poignant today than it was in the early 1990s when the movie came out. Nonetheless, coming back to this American dream. So defining the dream, it's a house in the burbs, or a house, but particularly depicted as a house in the burbs. It's the wife, dependent wife. Maybe she does a bit of part-time work, but primarily dependent. 2.4 children, a basic car, a basic house in the burbs, by the way. We're not talking a mansion here. A basic entry-level motor vehicle like Ford or General Motors, something like that. And 2.4 children. And every year you have an annual, driving holiday where you drive to, in America, it's like, along Route 66 and going east to west. Or in Australia, it would be, particularly if you're on the east coast, it would be up the Pacific Highway, and Canada, it would be, I don't even know what the main roads are in Canada, but anyway, the annual driving vacation. So staying at pretty ordinary 2.5, 3-star hotels, but adequate enough. They were comfortable enough, and I remember doing that as a kid. So. I'm not sure I'd want to do it today, but anyway, at the time it seemed okay. I remember stopping with this is with the folks and the family stopping in one hotel, and the guy said to the owner of the hotel, or the manager, whoever it was, said that they've had a few people stopping today, and they've only got a small hot water system, so you're going to have to do if you want to shower, you're going to have a cold shower. And then he came out with a list of things. Oh, by the way, the phone doesn't work, and the electricity. If you want electricity, you're going to put money in the meter, and if you want this one, and I look back on it now, and you go, "Holy crap! Is that the standard that was around at the time?" But anyway, that was the American dream. The 2.4 children, house in the burbs, the entry-level car. Now, there are a vast number of people when I was a kid that were living that. So it was no illusion. It was no fantasy. It was real. And why was it so then? And why is it not now? And exactly how widespread was it back then? Now, pretty much anyone on an average wage, and if you were on a below average wage, you could work overtime or take a second job or something like that. But anyone on an average wage could afford that lifestyle. Now, it was it was a very basic 3-bedroom house. The bedrooms were small. There was one bathroom, one toilet. There was either no garage or maybe a carport. The back, the block of land would have been a decent size, but you'd have had no chance getting council approval to build something at the back. There'd maybe be a small portable shed where you would store things like the lawnmower. And again, very basic. It wouldn't be brick or something like that. It would be what in Australia at least was called weatherboard, um, and like a fibro sort of thing. So it can get pretty cold in the winter. You would cook a little bit in the summer, depending on which way the house faced full west. There was no thought given to positioning. It was a grid system of streets mainly. So yeah, the chances are your house, either the front or the back, would be facing full west. So unless you planted trees to shade it, so you get pretty hot in the summer and pretty cold in the winter. Electricity was cheap, very cheap, so that was affordable. People had electric heaters all over the place because you could have fans, because you could afford the electricity easily at the time. Food was pretty basic, actually. There was certainly in the average household there was nothing fancy in the cuisine. A lot of potato, and I mean the food was much cheaper then. Quite a lot of steak got eaten, but the potato and I don't know, baked beans and things like that were staples of the diet. So people were conscious of the cost. I remember garbage being thrown out. It was certainly not much of a throwaway. I was a kid, but going back as sort of my earliest memories, the garbage bins were like a quarter of the size they are today, and they would never be full. And so there was a small sort of package of stuff was put in the garbage can, and that was it. And if there was any food, people were very concerned about food leftovers, that they didn't want to waste anything. And I remember that being a bigger issue back then than it certainly is now, or that I see around me. So the idea of throwing things out, wasting things, was definitely a no-no. But anyway, it was that dream possible? And would you call it a dream today? I remember telephones were expensive. So quite a few households actually didn't have a telephone because they were considered to be too expensive. And there would be like a public, as the Americans call it, a public call box, like a public telephone booth, so you could always have access to a telephone if you needed things like I don't know, calling a doctor or something. So, but the idea of telephones in the house, people had them, but it wasn't widespread. Not everyone had a telephone. And when I was a little kid, not everyone had a color television. Still, people had the old, black and white televisions. Anyway, was the dream possible? Yes, it was. Now, I noticed this when I finished high school and before I started college. There was a 3 or 4 month break, and in those days they paid, and they still do now, I don't know. In those days they paid different rates of pay depending on your age. So if you were 17, you got, I don't know, 65% of an adult wage. When you're 18, you got 75%, so on until you became 21, and only then did you get an adult wage. So that was pretty much how things were. Again, I don't know if that's the case today, but in that nearly 4 months between when high school, senior high school ended and college started, I am then, would I go on vacation? Would I do this? Would I do that? So I ended up thinking, I'll work and I'll save a lot of money, which I'll then, maybe buy a house or something. So I wasn't quite sure what I'd do, but this comes back to the point: was it possible then to realise the dream? Now, I'm not talking about a downtown mansion. I'm talking about a suburban type apartment or a house. So anyway, so I got a job. And jobs were easy to come by then. I mean, it was for me anyway. I sort of rocked in up to the front door of a place, like even if they were looking for someone, not saying, hi, my name's Billy Bob, I'm looking for something to eat, and they'd look you up and down. Oh, yep, I've got something. You can do this or do that, and it was very seat of the pants, I guess. But I went up to this distribution depot, and the guy, like whoever was in charge, hired me on the spot. And then he when he understood that I could read and understand invoices and bills of lading and various basic accounting paperwork, when he worked out I could understand that, he gave me he said, "Well, look, you can read and write and understand. I'll give you the foreman's job." So I ended up being the supervisor of guys like 10 times my age, all of whom seemed to be minimally literate. So I got the foreman's job and was paid an extra. Oh, I don't know how much it was. So that was something like back in the day, I don't know, $75 a week, something like that. It was for 5 days. And I also had a job which I had previously, but went back to it, of working for a landscape gardener on the weekends. This is over the summer time in Australia. Summer, Christmas, summer. It's in summertime, being in the southern hemisphere. So I did that. That landscape gardener was an asshole, by the way. I mean, I learned more swear words working for him than I'd ever known in my life. But he paid well, and he paid cash, and he used to pay. I think it was $40 a day, or was it $40 cash for the weekend? Can't remember now, but it's whatever it was. It seemed like a lot of money to me, and then I got a night job doing what was I doing? Like working in a petrol station or something like that. And so I looked at my my income, and it was the cash I would put in my pocket each week, and it was close to double the average wage. So I looked at what would it cost to buy a house and deposit or a property of some sort, could be an apartment, and I looked at all that and realized back in the day that I could buy, assuming, because when you're young you can keep up that sort of rate of work, assuming I kept that, I was making more than double the average wage at the time. And again, and I hadn't yet turned 18; I was only 17. And so I could realize I could buy, within 2 years, I would have enough money to buy a property and easily service a mortgage from an average wage. Now, again, this would have been a basic property. It wouldn't have been a mansion on the waterfront. It would have been basic, but nonetheless, it could be done, and it could be done without too much trouble. And this is for a 17-year-old. No help from the parents or anything. It would have been all the money I would have made from the work. Now, I knew other people that that worked long hours, and they worked 10 jobs and all this sort of stuff, and every waking hour was pretty much put on was working, and they could also realize that. So someone who was a cleaner, I knew a guy who was a cleaner, for example. He was a cleaner at this depot that I was working at, and he worked numerous jobs as a cleaner, not highly paid, but because he was working 80, 90 hours a week, or was able to get paid for 80, 90 hours a week, his income was actually quite decent. So him, even though he was effectively an illiterate peasant, he was like an Australian guy, but he was severe dyslexia, so he couldn't read, so he was in effect illiterate. So he could only accept verbal instruction. So he's very limited in the work he could do. But even him, provided he was prepared to put the hours in, he could buy a house. And that's how it was then. So this is no dream. This was a reality in the day. It was possible and it was affordable. Now, if I look at the first house that I bought, which cost me $70,000, and I thought that was a fuckload of money back then. I mean, I was in like my early 20s or something when I bought it, but $70,000. That same house today is worth like over $2 million. It sells for over $2 million. And the next house I bought, I paid $200 for some years later. That's worth $2.5 million today. I bought a block of land for $30,000. That would sell for over $1 million today, and so on. So that gives you an idea as to how much prices have increased, and how much faster they've increased than wages. So when people look at the American dream or the Western dream, again, you could do it in Australia as well. When people look at the so-called American dream and say, well, it never existed, it did exist. It very much existed. It was very much a reality. Now, it didn't mean that everyone could do it, depending on how cavalier or careless or destructive they were. For example, there was a guy I knew who had quite a good job. He was quite well paid, but he had a gambling addiction, and so they could never afford to have anything. Like he had no chance because he had this gambling addiction. So even though he could have easily afforded it, so if you engaged in self-destructive behaviour, or you were, incredibly unfortunate, maybe you had, bad health, or some intervening factor like that. But for the average citizen on an average wage, with average aspirations, the ordinary small house in the burbs, that sort of, it could be done. And the guy working in the factory, uh, on the average wage, could have a dependent wife and children, 2 or 3 children, and a house, the ordinary house and the basic car. There's a guy I knew that worked I can't remember what he did in a factory, but worked in a factory, and he took all the overtime he could get. There was always back then, I don't know, maybe it still is, there was always overtime available for him, if he wanted, or for those who wanted it. And even then, it surprised me that people would turn down overtime when it was available. I thought, well, why would you do that? Now, again, as a young guy, I thought, well, why would you turn that down, the opportunity of money? But these are people who had children and wives and waiting for them at home. And so they would see things differently. There was the quality of life versus just the money on its own. But this guy took all the overtime he could get. If it was on offer, he'd take it. And when the supervisors realised that he would always be good for overtime, they would kind of come to him first. So he was getting, I don't know, 20 plus hours a week overtime, and again on an average factory wage, but he was always getting this overtime, which was like time and a half or double time or whatever it was. And so he was doing rather well. So he had a higher standard of living than the others. I remember he had a nicer car and this sort of stuff. And I remember he bought a new car, and he was telling me about it, and like he came over to show me, and it was a pretty hot. I thought it was a pretty hot set of wheels, but this was all paid for. So he tells me by all this overtime he worked. So yes, the American dream, again, realisable in Australia, was very much real. It was absolutely real. Anybody on an average wage that didn't engage in self-destructive behaviour could do it. And if you had to be prudent with your money, you couldn't be lashing out on consumer goods and so on. And there are a much smaller array of consumer goods at the time, and you had the credit was much harder, so you had to save up for things. So it forced a discipline on you. I mean, I can't remember what I wanted to first buy something, and it cost, I don't know, $200 or something, which again was like all the money I would make in an entire week. So it was something that I would save up for. The idea of borrowing money or buying something on credit, not that you couldn't do it then, but for a 17-year-old or 18-year-old, it was nigh impossible unless you got like adults to guarantor you. So I would save up, just okay, well, I want this, I'm just going to have to wait 6 months for it, or a month, or however long, and save it up. So it's a different concept of financial discipline back in the day. So people had very small, other than say a mortgage, they had, or say car payments, they had very small amount of debt, and that was a very different dynamic to now, where pretty much everyone I know is, even if they've got a waterfront mansion, there's many people who are just swimming in debt and who are quite careless with their money and buying consumer goods. So different times, different attitudes, different views, but the key thing is the purchasing power of the paycheck was vastly more potent then than it is now, and property, be it rent or mortgages, is about 3.5 times more expensive today than it was then relative to wages. So the purchasing power of, and I've said this a million times now in videos previously, yet 18 to 20% of your income would go on rent or mortgage, in the 1970s as an example. Or so saying, not picking 1970 as a baseline year, 18 to 20% of your average wage would go on, whereas today it's 65% plus of your average wage would go on that same property. So it just shows that that the reason the American dream, as we can generically call it, is unattainable today is because of that change in purchasing power, and no other fucking reason. You've been a Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.